Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. In this special series, I sit down with globally recognised academics whose life work explores power, gender, negotiation, and leadership. Together, we unpack the subtle forces that shape how women are seen, heard, and valued at work. If you want deeper insight into the dynamics of influence and what truly accelerates leadership impact, this is a must listen. I'm so thrilled today to be joined by Rosalind Chow. Rosalind, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Let me share who you are, including your little cheeky ending to your bio, which I'm sure we'll touch on as well. So, Rosalind Chow is an academic expert on power, status, and social hierarchy, whose book, The Doors You Can Open, was just selected for the long list of the Non-Obvious Book Awards. Rosalind is an associate professor of organisational behaviour and theory at Carnegie Mellon, and she specialises in studying topics that are no longer allowed to be discussed in the United States. Rosalind, great to have you with me. As I just mentioned with the book, you've written a book called The Doors You Can Open, and it goes on to say a new way to network, build trust, and use your influence to create a more inclusive workplace. One of the reviews that I read said, "You've transformed how people think about the dirty word networking." So, my first question to you is, why does networking matter and why is it a dirty word?
Well, if I might do a little bit of self-promotion first, just because I don't normally do this, but I actually just found out this morning that the book was not only long-listed, but also shortlisted. Um,
Amazing.
I'm very excited for that. When they explained why it made the shortlist, they um, they read an excerpt, and the excerpt was specifically about what you're calling out, which was that they liked that it was a new way of thinking about networking, specifically in that it's trying to transition us from thinking about networking as an activity where we give and receive from ourselves to others to one where we are actually just conduits and where we essentially act as the pipes through which people can give and receive from each other, not
Mm.
necessarily from us. And so they pulled that out as one of the new insights that they thought was really interesting about the book. So to answer your question, the reason networking matters is because you kind of can't advance if people don't know who you are. So most people understand this as, you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know,
Yes,
right? And I think you put it really wonderfully before. Actually, we were talking where it's not just about who you know, it's about who knows you,
exactly.
right? And who can speak on your behalf when you're not around. Now, the reason networking tends to be feel really icky is because when we go into networking situations, often we feel like we have something we need or want from other people. So if you're not well known, if you lack visibility and you want to be more visible, you're trying to connect with people who can make you more visible. But anytime we need or want something from other people, it automatically puts us in a lower power position, which most people I would gather probably would not prefer to feel low
Absolutely
in
not.
power. And so what that means is we feel like we have to justify why it would be worthwhile for the other person to want to know us. And so we feel like we have to sell ourselves. We have to figure out what kind of value proposition we bring to the table. And it turns this relationship building activity into something that's much more transactional. And that's just not how people really want to think about their relationships, right? It's not about what we can give or take from each other. It's about being more authentic and genuine in making a connection. But when we think about networking as, okay, I need something from you, it makes it very difficult to create those genuine and sincere connections.
And, I would add to that as you were talking, I was thinking, this is a group of high performers who, almost without exception, don't like asking for help either. Used to work
Yeah,
right out on their own. So it's like a double ick from that perspective. Rosalind, I'm not surprised your book is shortlisted, and I'm sure that the book is going to do exceptionally well. I shared with you off camera that, my wonderful co-founder and I, Kelly, both devoured your book and have actively used your book and some of the insights in that in coaching many of the executives we work with. So it's a truly wonderful resource. So I want to thank you for writing it. But before we go any further into it, what is your story? I mean, how did you end up studying sponsorship? How did the book come about? Tell us about yourself.
sure. So, as you mentioned, I am a faculty member. Carnegie Mellon is a research institution. What that functionally means is that, yes, I teach, but teaching is just how I pay myself to do what the school actually values, which is generation of new knowledge and research. And so, my area of research, as you mentioned, power, status, social hierarchy, I usually studied them within the context of things we no longer can talk about, such as racial and gender inequality. Um, and one of the first things you learn when you study inequality is that it is incredibly difficult to change.
Mm,
So once you have a system that is unequal, um, both there are things that both sides do that make it so that it's likely that the status quo remains. And my research earlier in my career was really more on what people who were in the dominant group, right, the ones who were higher in status or higher in power, um, the things that we, and I will include myself in that category as someone who is quite privileged in many ways. Um, there are all sorts of things that we do, consciously or unconsciously, that unfortunately serve to maintain these inequalities that we observe pretty much in every single culture or society we have across the world. Um, and after publishing research for about like 15 or so years about like, and here is yet another way that we are unwittingly reinforcing these inequalities that some of us actually would really like to see get smaller.
mm.
I got a little tired of having to constantly write about how intractable it was. So I started thinking about how can we actually have dominant group members who want to mitigate or change this inequality. What can they do to help? And sponsorship became one of those strategies that I really glommed onto as something that is understudied and not understood very well. It's starting to have a little bit more of a heyday in the business world. So I think more and more people now understand that sponsorship is something that is important. Precisely why or how it's different from mentorship is a different question. One that again I think is not very clear, but it is, and as I put in the book, I think it is a strategy that all of us actually, regardless if we're in the dominant group or the subordinate group, that we have the power actually
Mm.
to engage in to help others.
So when I think about then, you finished your sort of depressing study around how dominant power groups work to stay dominant power groups, I guess, and then sponsorship has come about as a way that those in power can do something. that can actually promote some change. Were you always destined to be an academic researcher? Like, did you grow up dreaming that that was what you were going to do, Rosalind?
No, I originally really wanted to be a marine biologist. Um and but was I think I got scared off by the idea of all the different like advanced bio and chemistry classes that I was going to have to take. Um, so I then thought I was going to be a clinical psychologist. Um, Ended up working to do research in a psychology lab to make myself a competitive candidate for a graduate program. And I also did a stint in a suicide hotline
Right.
to get some experience, being more patient facing. Very quickly realized from doing that I would not want to have handled cases, um, but that I really enjoyed the research side. And I my father actually is an accounting professor. I had told him that I wanted to go into social psychology. He told me, well, there's this other field called organizational behavior that you should probably consider moving into. And I, being a headstrong, young, independent woman, was like, Dad, what do you know? Um, and then a couple of years later, actually independently found my way into an organizational behavior class and realized that that was a really fantastic fit for the things that I wanted to do. So thank you, Dad, even though I didn't listen to him at first,
Yeah.
but I recognized the wisdom there later.
I love that you're thanking your dad for that now. And there's a beautiful story in the book that I encourage people to read where you talk about your dad suggesting this and you ignoring that advice. And then a good friend that you respected suggested the same thing. And it seemed like a good idea then. So, okay. So this series that we're in is focused on power, status, and influence. And I love how your book offers not just a diagnosis of the problem, but a practical playbook in terms of what to do about it. So, with your permission, I'd love to do three things today. Firstly, walk through the key findings on sponsorship and mentorship and why they are different. And you alluded to that just before. Secondly, connect why this matters to the incredible women listening today. And then thirdly, let's get tactical about what women can do to build trust and to use their influence more effectively. You up for that?
Absolutely.
So let's start with your key findings on sponsorship and why it is different from mentorship.
So, um, I should first say that if anyone is to blame for this confusion that people have about mentorship and sponsorship, academics like myself are probably to blame, because for a long time, sponsorship has actually been seen as a subcategory of mentorship.
Ah, interesting.
And so people actually legitimately use those terms interchangeably. Um, the way that I think about sponsorship and mentorship now is that you want to ask yourself a key question, which is who is being asked to change? Who's being acted upon? Mentorship is usually a situation where a mentor is acting on a mentee or somehow trying to get the mentee to change in some way.
Mhm.
So when you think about people who are giving you coaching or feedback or advice on how to navigate a difficult situation, or even they could, academics consider like role modeling to be a part of mentorship as well. All of this is designed to change the mentee, right? To make them think about themselves a particular way, to behave a certain way. It's about creating an identity that makes them feel like they're competent and capable at work. Sponsorship, on the other hand, it says, protege, you're amazing. You don't need to do anything, right? And what actually needs to change is the social situation around you. So what I need to do is I need other people to see you as amazing as I see you
Mm.
as being. And so the target is different, right? The target is not the protege. It is external audience, independent people who are around the protege, but the protege stays the same.
Mm.
Um, Now, I should be clear, you can do both at the same time, right? Many of our mentors are also our sponsors. So it's not to say that you can only sponsor someone when they're like a fully baked product. But sponsors, they will have something that they truly believe in terms of their protege that they're willing to share out with other people.
Mm.
And so the actions that they are engaging in are very different, right? They're not coaching, they're not giving advice, they're hyping you up. Uh, they're making people see you differently, or they're creating impressions of you in the minds of other people. So they're very different types of behaviors.
I love that. And, you hear the old a mentor talks to you and a sponsor talks about you. And I think that's accurate. But the way you've put that in terms of who is the change designed to affect, I think that's really powerful. So they're talking about you because they want to create a different version or story, or they want people to see you in the same light they see you, I think is fantastic. You mentioned in the book, and I'd love you to touch on it, something you found that organizations often do wrong with sponsorship programs. Can I get you to touch on that?
Yeah, so hard to say because a lot of programs in organizations are actually mentorship programs. A lot of sponsorship programs, because organizations, they're not distinguishing between the two. Sometimes they call them sponsorship programs, but inevitably they tend to become mentorship programs. And the way this is typically structured, because unless you give these programs a lot of resources, there's not a lot of bandwidth that the program managers have to work with. But they typically start with the people they want to see receive mentorship or sponsorship. And so they create this cohort of people they would like to receive those things. And then they identify a separate group, more senior, to either be mentors or sponsors, right? And then they pair them together. It's an arranged marriage. If there's resources, maybe there's a launch party. Some, corporate leaders will come in to say how much they support the program, and everybody says yay, and then crickets.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of times the mentees are like, should I be getting the mentor? Like, should I be scheduling these meetings? And the mentor is like, I'm just going to wait for the mentee to come ask for help when they need it. And then basically nobody ever meets, right?
Mhm.
Or they meet and it's just super awkward because they have no idea why they've been assigned to each other. And unless the mentor is emotionally intelligent and able to kind of pull information out of the mentee, it's not always clear why the match makes sense.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think corporations get wrong often is they don't start with the person who's providing the support. They're starting with the people who are receiving the support. And I understand why they do it that way. And within the context of a mentorship relationship, that actually might even be okay. Because to be a good mentor, obviously you have to show up and actually like share and give time to your mentee. But for the mentee to actually benefit that from that relationship, they have to trust the mentor. You're not really asking for anything from the mentor other than their time.
Yes.
And now, sponsorship programs or sponsorship relationships are totally different. When someone is willing to sponsor you, they trust you they have to, because what they're doing is they're putting their social relationships on the line
Mm.
by advocating for you or amplifying you and speaking to your strengths. And so, what you really need to do then is to do a really good job selling the sponsors on why the proteges are the right person for them. And so, when I consult with companies about their sponsorship programs, we put a lot of emphasis on explaining to the sponsors precisely what the selection criteria are for how proteges are selected, why this match is the one that we have made, so that it becomes clear, like there's some intentionality behind this,
Yes.
right? And that we're not taking the sponsors' social capital for granted, that they're not just going to go out and speak well of someone they have zero existing relationship with.
Mm.
So our programs focus much more on creating that relationship of trust with between sponsors and proteges, almost to the point where the program actually doesn't involve sponsorship at all. It is purely about creating this relationship, because if we do a good job of facilitating that relationship, the sponsorship will follow naturally.
Yes.
Um, so we actually spend more time educating the sponsors on what sponsorship is, how they can be doing it, not just to support this person who's in the program with them, but
Mm.
also everybody else that they're working with. So it's a nice way to kind of have an idea spread through a leadership group.
I think that's a lovely way that you say that and express that, because what I was thinking as you were talking before you got to the end was you can't force a sponsorship relationship, right? Like they have to deeply trust and understand the capabilities of the person before they're going to be willing to kind of, throw them out there. Is this a natural point to talk a little bit about building that trust? Or is this a point, do we talk here about, there's a theme in the book as well around sort of status trumping power, for example. Is it worth sitting there? You tell me what the next natural point is to explore there.
Interesting. So actually, I think this is a good time for me to point out to your listeners that a lot of leaders highlight competence as the thing that they care most about. So when I have leaders who are assigned to proteges and there's some hesitation or resistance, a lot of times that hesitation or resistance comes from them feeling like they haven't had firsthand experience with the protege's work ethic or work
Yes.
output, right? And all of that is actually a very competence based, those are competence based concerns that, you can actually give them sort of like objective information about to help allay their concerns. But competence is actually just one of three different components that go into trust. And most people or just don't think about the other two components. So they're called benevolence and integrity. I, for the purposes of simplicity, just put them together into this idea of like shared values. And the idea here is, does this person believe in the same things or care about the same things that I do? If they do, then if I ask them to do something, it should not be out of the ordinary for them to agree to it. And the other thing is, if we have shared values, we're more likely to care about each other. And therefore, I can also trust you for that reason, that you will go ahead and be able to do the thing that I say that you should do or I ask you to do. Okay, so ultimately it's this question of like, can they do it? Will they do it? And will they do it for me?
Mm.
And it's the will they do it and will they do it for me part, right? The shared values part and the relationship part that people don't spend as much time being intentional about cultivating. And so for people who are looking to be sponsored, one of the things that I recommend is to just be so much more overt about what your passions and motivations are, because you're trying to signal to other people what your values are.
Mm.
And your values are what distinguish you from other extremely highly competent people.
Mm.
Ultimately, in many organizations, there's lots of competent people to choose from, right?
Absolutely.
That potential sponsors can try and help out. And so, how do you distinguish yourself? You distinguish yourself by showing that you value something that is similar to what the sponsor values. And that is what's going to make the sponsor really pay attention to you and build that closer relationship that then leads to sponsorship. So, having clarity on what motivates you, what you're passionate about, what your core values are, and being transparent about those things, those are really important for building trust.
I guess the other thing, and you and I again touched on this, because it comes up a lot with a lot of the female leaders that I coach, is those trusting relationships take a level of vulnerability to build them. And you spend some time in the book kind of talking about that concept around, potentially why for many female leaders, they don't build the depth of relationships that potentially their male colleagues do. Can I get you to kind of take us there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, and I will also share from my own personal experience, right? I, I'm I present young. You're you can't see me, but I'm actually quite small. I'm 4'11". I guess I don't know what that would be in the metric system, but
We know 4'11", and you're right, that is tiny. Do you usually
it's
say 4'11 and a quarter or something like that?
actually, if I were being very honest and precise, I'd be 4'10" and 3/4.
I love that. My mum was 5'1", and she would always say 5'1 and a half.
Oh, yeah, I've already done the rounding up.
Yeah, gotcha. We're with you.
Um, so I'm very small, I'm young looking, I'm female, and also I'm Asian, which comes with its own stereotypes and baggage. And so I spent a lot of my early career trying really hard to get people to see me as competent,
Mm.
because my concern was that they would stereotype me as being incompetent. And I think this is probably true for many young women or females, in at work. And so you kind of put aside the other stuff and you're just like, I need to establish myself as being expert. I can make no mistakes,
Yes.
right? And that's all well and good, but again, that only satisfies half the equation, right? For this trust formula that we've generated. So now people see you as competent, but they don't understand any of the other things,
They don't
you
know
know.
you.
Right, exactly. So that's a hard place, I think, for a lot of females to be in. And so this is where I like, your other guest, Allison Vergale, she has this book called Likeable Badass, right? And the idea is the badass part is the competence component. And the likable part is pretty self-explanatory. And she basically makes the argument that females can be both simultaneously. It really does not have to be either or. And so she has some really great advice on how you can do that. And this goes along with your earlier comment where we're starting to veer away from power and into status. And so this is where it would be helpful to define them so that people know
Yes.
the difference. Power is control over resources. So our bosses have power over us because they control whether or not we're going to get fired,
Yes.
right? Like how much I'm going to get paid. Are they going to make my life more difficult by giving me like the good fun tasks or
Hmm.
like the dead end grunt work, right?
Yep.
All of that is power. Status is admiration and respect. So people confuse power and status with influence when the way to think about it is that power and status both enable you to exert influence. So power is not influence, right? Power allows you to influence others, and status allows you to influence others. And I think what people actually want is influence.
Yeah.
And if you're part of a group that is assumed to lack power, then the way to also be able to exert influence is to go after status. And the strategies for gaining status and power are very different. Um, we give status to people who show themselves to care about the group, to be other oriented, to be very warm, to be communal. Basically, starts to sound a lot like the stereotype that we would associate with females,
Mm.
right? And so you actually see that, leaders who are more participatory, right, they have a lot of status and they're able to have very effective teams. And it's not because they're wielding power, but it's because they're wielding status.
Mhm.
And so when if you've already established yourself as being very competent, it's actually okay to also open up and assuming this is your predilection, right? That you do want to be the caring and empathic and communal person, leader at work. Like there's actually no penalty to that
Mm.
when it's already been paired with high competence. So, you know, um, that is another way to gain status and to be able to exert influence over others.
Okay, so, and I think the interesting thing there was you talk about the fact that ultimately status trumps influence in terms of outcomes. And I think the language you use around that is around the difference from an influence perspective, whether people are doing things because they have to or doing things because they want to.
Yeah, so we do things for powerful people because we have to, and we do things for people who are high in status because we want to. And what's also very different about those two forms of influence is kind of how obvious or how conscious people are about what is happening. So when parents say, you should do this because I told you so, that is a very obvious use of power,
Right.
right? But if your parent, if you like already respect your parent, they will tell you to do something and you will do it. No questions asked. And it's not because you're worried that they're going to get angry with you if you don't. They haven't threatened you in any sort of way. You just do it because you want to maintain that relationship with them, right? They're someone is like has you in mind. So of course you're gonna follow their advice on what you should be doing. So it doesn't there's no conscious like thought of, well, what might happen if I decide not to do this? It just becomes a matter of course of like, oh yeah, okay. Like they said this would be a good thing for me to do, so of course I will do it. Um, which is actually just from a hierarchy maintenance perspective, a much more sustainable path.
Hmm. So, why does this matter? Let's draw the connection then around why does this actually matter for the senior women listening? How do we translate this to them?
So, the reason I talk about power and status in this way goes back to this notion of networking, seeing networking through power, which is again this idea that, like, well, I network because I have resources, they have resources. I need to find the right people to exchange resources with, which is kind of our traditional version of networking. Um, and what I'm trying to argue for instead is networking through the lens of status, which is how do I want to gain status within a network? If the way that I gain respect and admiration is by showing myself to be other oriented, then it's not about the resources that I have. Although that's one way to do it, right? Is just to selflessly give. Um, but another way, if you're someone who doesn't have the resources like internally within yourself in terms of what you have control over or your own kind of areas of expertise or ability, is to still provide values to other people through who you can connect with each other.
Mhm.
So it's the difference between into a networking event and thinking, who can I find here who will solve this problem of me wanting a job, let's say,
Yes.
right? Um, and where I'm obviously like needing something from other people, it's to instead walk into those situations and say, everyone here has a problem. I don't know what their problem is, but I'm certain that I can probably help them solve their problem. There's at least one person here who has a problem I can help solve.
Mm.
And so now my task is to actually go to different people and figure out what their problems are so that I can start making these connections that will help everybody solve their problems. I'm not solving them myself, but I am giving them access to the person who could be the solution to their problem. So you're still adding value by making those connections. And when you do that, you gain status. And people, if you do this enough, and if you're listening carefully, right, when you think of people who have problems, you can think of job opportunities and people who are solutions who'd be like, oh, the other people I know who would be perfect candidates for that job opportunity. Um, the more of these connections that you're making, the more value you're giving to the network, it adds to your own reputation and status within the network that also raises your own visibility to other people. So
You
you
use,
get the visibility in the
yeah,
end.
you use a great example, which I'll touch on in a minute. But when I read your book, and then when you and I first met, and you explained this concept around turning networking from what might be more based on old masculine kind of stereotypes about, I'm going in with a very individual focus to fix a problem I have, therefore I need something from you, which is to find me a job or find someone who can connect me, to this more communal basis of going in and thinking, there's a problem, I might know a solution somewhere along the way. I could instantly think of someone who I've always thought of as a brilliant connector. She often came up as, in the early days when people used to look at LinkedIn and they used to look at how connected people were, she was always the most connected anywhere. But when I actually sat back and thought about it, the magic of what she does is almost every conversation is, well, how can I help you?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. So, okay, keep going. You're on a train there, and let's get back on that. You told the story about Elizabeth. That's where I was going. I think it was Elizabeth who you were recommending, and that brought visibility to you.
That's right. So this goes to the kind of one of the unspoken question or the ambiguous question that comes from the title of the book. And in fact, my agent was very not in favor of this title. She said, it doesn't like people don't know what you're promising. And the reason for that is because like the doors you can open, the question is like, well, for whom? Is it
Mm,
for you? Right. And if, or for somebody else. And, after you read the book, you realize, well, it's actually opening it for somebody else, but actually in doing that, it's also opening it for you. So you get both.
mm,
Um, but a question that I always get is, well, how do I find a sponsor, or how do I get a sponsor? Um, and my answer to that is like, well, if you're already thinking about how you need a sponsor, you're automatically already in that power mindset of like, I have this need.
mm,
So instead, to think about, all right, who can I sponsor? So be a sponsor. And as I was saying before, the more you sponsor others, the more others will pay attention to you and want to sponsor you in turn.
mm,
Because when you're going out and sponsoring other people, you're showing yourself, again, to be very other oriented and also to be paying attention to what people need and what people can offer. Which, in a world that's kind of negative these days, is kind of a refreshing change, right? Where you have someone who is going out and really identifying other people's strengths and being able to name them. Like that is a real superpower.
mm,
Um, so when you're a sponsor, when you can recognize and call and name other people's strengths and make that known to others, that becomes your superpower, right? Of being able to make these matches. Um, and then people will want to sponsor you because they will come to you, they will start to come to you with their problems. They won't call it their problems, right? They'll come to you with their opportunities because you might know, right? You might be the person who can connect them, or because now you have access to all those opportunities, you can just tell them, that sounds like a great opportunity for me.
mm.
And now you've already built up all the goodwill there, right? You've essentially built this trust with all these people around you that makes it very easy for them to sponsor you.
Can I ask you a question about there's some stories you tell in the book about the concept of not being seen. You know, you referred to visibility earlier, and you talk about, there maybe never was a time when you could do this, but you certainly can't just keep your head down and hope. And you share a story of Joe who was in that situation where people just didn't see Joe as leadership material. How do you how do you work around that?
That is a very hard one. Um, and both Joe and Mark in the book, the only way they could get out of that situation was by moving networks, quite frankly.
Mm,
They had to go to a different context where they didn't, I guess, like have kind of the same baggage, the same reputation that had already been developed around them in
mm,
those spaces. And they essentially created new identities for themselves in this new network structure. Um, that's a very extreme way
yeah.
of dealing with that situation. But if you have a sponsor, no matter who they are, the thing what you can do is you can essentially start get your sponsor to make connections for you into a new network so that you can potentially start rebuilding, right, what your reputation is among a new set of people who don't have already a fixed perception of you. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, like once an impression is set, it's hard to change, which is why as a sponsor, and now we're getting to the tactical part,
Yes.
um, it's much easier to take someone who has no reputation at all, who is completely unknown, or at least relatively unknown, and to create that reputation around them. So, which is why so many of us only sponsor people who are sure things, right?
Yes.
They're sure bets because again, it takes a lot of trust. You don't want to oversell or, perhaps make a poor match because that comes back to bite you as a sponsor. But for a person who's relatively unknown, you have a lot of ability to shape what other people like, how much attention they receive, how people interpret their behavior or their outcomes. And you can build on that because once you create a positive impression, it is much easier to maintain a positive impression than it is to change a negative one.
Yeah.
And so, I also talk about in the book about protecting, and that's really about changing people's negative perceptions, but that's much harder.
I'll come to that in a minute, but it does, I obviously I won't use names, but just a recent conversation with a brilliant executive whose leader recognizes that brilliance, but shared that at CEO level, there's at best a neutral or an old story that's circulating about this person. And it was fascinating. I think I understood that his role as a sponsor was to actively play a role in changing that. But it was really interesting, just the insights out of your book, I think gave me the words to really make it clear that no one else is going to change that story. Like you are the person who has to lead and change that story. And part of that is making sure the person gets access and exposure.
Right. Yeah.
It's not one dimensional, the things you have to do that, but it is difficult. Before we go to the really tactical things that maybe people can do, when is gossip good gossip?
So good gossip is when you're saying nice things about people, right? Um, People typically, when they think of gossip without an adjective in front, right? They automatically think of the negative version, right? So people are saying not great things about you, or sometimes people just don't like being talked about in general. So that there's that. Um, the lowest hanging fruit of sponsorship is good gossip. Um, and it's low hanging fruit because there's very little risk. So if you remember, I was saying earlier, why do sponsors have to trust proteges? It's because they're putting their social relationships at risk, and the more trust the sponsor asks the other people to put in them, right? The more they're just like, just trust me.
Yes.
They're putting the trust that that person has with them kind of as collateral, and using that as collateral against the trust that this other person should have, like, is going to have in the protege. And so if the protege doesn't pan out, then like both versions of trust are gone.
Yeah.
So good gossip is helpful because it doesn't require the sponsor to say just trust me.
Mm,
Because the sponsor, when you're saying nice things about other people, you're not guaranteeing anything about some uncertain outcome, right? So Melissa, if you're like, oh, Rosalind, was just her book was just selected for the shortlist, that is an objective, verifiable truth.
hmm.
No one's going to come back and say, like, Melissa, you told me that it was on the shortlist and that wasn't true.
Yes.
But if you said, well, actually Rosalind's book is going to blow your mind and you're going to like think that it's the best thing since Marmite, um, there's a possibility the person's going to be like, you really overhyped this, right?
Yes.
So that's uncertain. And so good gossip takes the risk out of sponsorship in many ways, especially if you maintain the gossip to be just about objective, verifiable facts that have already happened.
Okay. Okay, I'm very happy to both provide good gossip and trust me when it comes to your book. But let's get tactical about what women can do with the framework here. So, if you think about three things people could do, what do you think they should do?
Well, one I would say is to start paying attention to who other people pay attention to. Um, so many of us, when we think about networking, we're very, um, we know that we should pay attention to the people we're connected to. So, what we would call our first layer ties or first degree ties. But there's actually so much more in the second layer that many of us either don't know about, right? Or we just don't pay attention to. And so when you're going around, you can focus on, well, I guess what I would say is, again, pay attention to who is paid attention to and who is not paid attention to, because that will tell you what is valued in the system. But then if there's a person who's not particularly visible, but has qualities that are valued by the system, that's your opportunity to be their sponsor. And I'm realizing now, one of the things that I think was implied in some of the things that I said earlier, right, is when you sponsor others, you gain status, right? And this is why my sponsorship of Elizabeth was so impactful. Elizabeth was at the time a doctoral student who was working with me on a project related to sponsorship. I presented the work at a very small, but I would say important conference. It was held at Harvard Business School, and there was somebody from Harvard Business Review who was in the audience that day to listen to my talk. And at the end of my talk, I let everyone know that Elizabeth was going to be on the job market soon, and that if they liked what we were working on here, that they really should give her a good hard look, because she would be a great hire for them. So I essentially used my opportunity to talk about the work to also sponsor Elizabeth very explicitly. And the person in the room happened to be a co-host of the podcast Women at Work, which was a very popular Harvard Business Review podcast. Unfortunately, it just ended not so long ago. But the host then told one of the producers to reach out to me. And one of the reasons she chose me in particular was not just because I was working on sponsorship, but they were looking for someone who did it.
Yes.
And so that one little moment of sponsorship, which really wasn't even intended for her, it was
Yeah.
intended for the other academics in the room. Excuse me, got me the attention
Mhm.
of this podcast host. I then ended up going on the Women at Work podcast as a expert guest, and that got me connected with Amy Gallo. And Amy went on to write a fabulous book on how to deal with difficult coworkers. It's called Getting Along.
Mhm.
Um, and she interviewed me for that book. And I, at that time, had been thinking about writing a book. And I used that opportunity to say, hey, Amy, I have this idea. Like, what do you think about it? And she loved the idea, really gave me so much encouragement to go out and to actually pursue this, offered to make referrals to agents for me. But
Mhm.
I would say, actually, most critically, took the core idea that I had pitched to her and sponsored me to HBR, to their editors. And that's how I got my first HBR article. Once
Amazing. All from recommending Elizabeth. What would be the second and third thing that you would think about?
I'm sorry, I liked it time wise. Okay. So, second thing, it's not about, and this goes back to your earlier distinction between power and status. You can be a sponsor no matter how much power you have. All that matters is that people trust you. So if there are people who trust you, you can be a sponsor to those people. And that's how you can spin up your sponsorship flywheel, right? And get that cycle going. So you don't have to like put all your chits into this very risky kind of situation where you're advocating for someone to an audience where you're not sure how you're seen. You can start small with a group of people who you already know hold you in high regard, and that will still also bring you benefits. So that would be one thing. That would be number two, is like worry less about power, more about status and trust. Um, Number three, I know that I have a number three, and but I feel like I've already talked about so many of the things. Usually it's power is not status, sponsorship's not mentorship. Um, I would just,
I can ask you, let me ask you, because it'll probably come to you while we're talking anyway, and you have offered so much in here. So there's so much gold in the conversation. We talk about trust being the foundation of so much of this. What do you know, see, or think is the impact of so much of our work being virtual these days on trust? Can you still build the trusting relationships you need in these
yeah,
sponsor relationships?
yes and no. Um, I think there's a lot of research coming out that suggests, on the whole, probably not, because people who are completely virtual workers, they seem to be they're less likely to be promoted. It's taking them longer to get promoted. So they're not, when you're not in the office and having the non-productive conversations around non-work related things, those are all opportunities for sharing out information about your values, right? And who you are as a whole, as opposed to just the competence part. Those opportunities are lost.
Yeah.
And so, but that's not to say that you can't try and make those opportunities come back. And so, for instance, one of my recommendations is like never use a Zoom background.
Yes.
Right. And I know that there are like nice curated, people will have nice curated things in the back. The thing you can't see is that pretty much everything else in my office there's like nothing on the walls except for this thing in the back here,
Yeah.
that is very intentional. That is my mother's an artist, and that is one of her paintings. There's a gong there. I suppose if my background weren't so blurry, you would see that. There's a
Yes.
picture of my children. I have a few choice ceramic like items there. And all of those are an invitation
Yes.
for other people
Mm.
to ask me about, in the same way that I might ask you about your family in the photo behind you, right?
They're a lot more grown up than that now, but yes, exactly. There's connection there, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so when we do the Zoom background, we're saying, I'm all business. There's
Yes.
nothing else, right? I don't want to talk about anything else. But then that removes the invitation and the opportunity to talk about these other aspects of our lives.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. So I could keep going all day with our conversation, but in respect to our listeners as well, the final question I ask everyone across these interviews, I ask everyone, what does brave feminine leadership mean? And so, Rosalind, what does brave feminine leadership mean from your perspective? And do you think it needs to change?
I think before, it was to show that it was possible to be a leader, and it was to make sure that there were um, women in places so that other women could see that they too could rise. And now I think we're in a stage where, again, there's not too many female leaders. Unfortunately, not as many as we would like, but certainly not just one or two anymore. And what that means is that there's more variance, there's more latitude in how those women can behave and show themselves as leaders, so that it's not just, okay, I have to be one of the boys or to act like a man in order to succeed. There are other ways of leading that now are just as effective and just as valued. And it makes it much, it essentially, the more we can open the door to showing other versions of what great leadership looks like, I think it will make leadership much more inclusive, and attainable, and therefore aspirational for all of our younger generations.
Rosalind, thank you so much for joining our conversation. It's just been an absolute pleasure to dive into all of your research and findings with you. So thank you from me and from our audience.
Oh, thank you for having me on.